The boast was already in the air when the human came up from the lower decks, and it was the kind of boast that gets a being killed. 10 days. Andivar Hesk was saying, one taloned finger raised against the slow turn of the planet in the viewing wall. 10 days, and I will stand in this room with the deacon's crest plate under my arm, and you, Suverin, will eat the contract in front of the entire exchange. The trophy hall of the Gilded Blind held perhaps 40 guests that night, and every one of them turned to watch him say it. The lodge hung in high orbit over Coldbrook like a jewel pinned to black velvet, all brass rails and bone chandeliers, and beneath it the planet rolled green and gray and patient, a world that did not know it had just been promised to a rich man's wall. Hesk stood at the center of the hall the way he stood at the center of every room he had ever entered, crest fully fanned, the iridescent plumes of a Sarathi magnate catching the lamplight in sheets of bronze and violet, the very feathers a ledger of his standing. 40 years of mergers had gone into that crest. 3 banking houses, an orbital yard at Tessin, a small moon, technically. Suverin Tolk, his rival in everything that could be counted, swirled the liquor in his glass and smiled the smile of a being who had already done the arithmetic. The Deacon has been sold 11 times, Andivar. 11 permits, 11 expeditions, 11 refunds. The lodge keeps a drawer just for the refunds. Reno, tell him about the drawer. Huntmaster Reno Sorek, broad and tusked and dressed in enough braid to rig a sail, spread his heavy hands in the practiced apology of a man who profits either way. The drawer exists, magnates. I will say only that the grayback in question is an exceptional animal. 1,200 kilos in the lean season. He has held the drowned miles for 30 years. The wardens down there have a saying, you don't hunt the deacon, you tithe to him. Wardens. Hesk let the words sit on his tongue like something a waiter should not have served. Humans, you mean. Humans, magnate. Coldbrook is theirs. It's a human world. It's a Lantern 5 world, said Suverin with relish, because the number was the whole point of the wager and everyone in the hall knew it. The Lantern Standard was the oldest honest thing in settled space. Every habitable world rated by the number of separate, sworn, signed warnings a visitor had to put their name to before they were allowed to touch its soil. 1 lantern for the garden worlds, 2 for the rough ones, 3 for worlds where the insurance syndicates wrote their own clauses, 4 for worlds you could not be rescued from in under a day. There were only a handful of 5s on the register, and beings did not visit them. Beings watched documentaries about them from very far away. Coldbrook was a 5. Humans had been farming it for 200 years. A Lantern 5 world, Hesk agreed, fanning his crest a degree wider, with a fat old fish bear at the top of it, and a species of mammal so famously stubborn they put their breeding pairs on it on purpose, none of which changes the ballistics of a Veil presentation rifle. 10 days, Suverin. The crest plate, this room, your contract, your teeth. Shall we put a number on it? 200 million, said Suverin Tolk. The hall made the sound that money makes when it is being watched. 200 million, said Andivar Hesk, and the wager existed. And at the staff rail by the service stair, a human woman in a faded warden's coat looked at him for a long, level moment and went back to drinking her tea. He noticed her the way he noticed all staff, which is to say as a shape that would either be useful or in the way. She was small even for a human, somewhere on the gray side of middle age, with a face like the leather of a good boot and hands that were wrong for indoors, scarred across the knuckles, 1 fingernail black and growing out. The coat said Coldbrook Warden Service over the breast and thread that had been re-sewn at least twice. She had been brought up from the surface that morning, Sorek explained, because the law was the law even for magnates. Nobody set foot on a Lantern 5 without a licensed warden attached to them like a chain to an anchor. Tess Calder, Sorek said, senior guide, North Coast District. She knows the drowned miles better than the tide does. Hess crossed the hall to her because the wager was made and the audience was watching, and a magnate closes a deal in person. You'll be taking me down to kill the deacon, he told her pleasantly. The human looked up at him. Sarathi stand a head taller than her species, and the crest adds another forearm of height, and she looked up the whole distance of that without her face doing anything at all. No, sir, she said. I'll be taking you down. The rest is between you and the coast. You doubt the outcome. I don't think about the outcome. I think about the root. She set the tea down. There's a bloom rising off the estuary. Spore mass. The trees down there throw pollen this time of year, a few billion tons of it, and it gets into lifters and beacons and anything else that breathes through a filter. I've put a hold on all client drops for 6 days. The Huntmaster has the notice. The hall had drifted closer, in the way halls do. Hesk let his crest settle into the gentle, amused tilt that boards of directors had learned to fear and beings at parties mistook for charm. 6 days, he said, is more than half of 10. You see my difficulty. I see it, the human said. It can wait 6 days. The deacon's been there 30 years. He's not going anywhere. She picked up her tea again. Neither is the bloom. which is the part I get paid to care about. She was the only being on the gilded blind who had not laughed at his jokes, asked after his holdings, or looked at his crest. And some part of Andivar Hesk, the part that had eaten 3 banking houses, found this so irritating that the decision made itself before he was aware of making it. He turned to Sorek with 200 million reasons in his voice. Huntmaster, my understanding is that the hold applies to the lodge's drop corridors. Charter me a private one. What happened next happened the way it always happened, which was the entire problem with being Andivar Hesk. The universe kept agreeing with him. Sorek's objection lasted as long as it took to name a figure. The flight plan was redrawn after midnight by a clerk who was paid to be sleepy, routing a single skiff down a corridor that existed only on the version of the chart that stayed in the lodge's private ledger. The official record, the one the orbital rescue net would read, showed the magnate's party landing at a licensed pad 300 kilometers south, snug behind the weather line, exactly where regulations wanted them. Tess Calder fought it for an hour in Sorek's office, flat-voiced, while Hesk drank the Huntmaster's brandy and watched the planet turn. She did not raise her voice. He would remember that later, with the particular shame that attaches to small things. She laid out the bloom charts and the lifter tolerances and the tide tables for the drowned, miles, and when Sorek spread his hands and said the word indemnified, she stopped arguing the way a door stops being open. You can refuse the assignment, Sorek told her, and he goes down with a stand-in guide from your client roster who's walked the miles twice in fair weather. She buttoned the faded coat. No, he goes down with me. That's what the 5th lantern means, Huntmaster. You don't get to hand it off because the client is heavy. She made Hesk sign the lanterns himself at the airlock at 4 in the morning lodge time while the porters loaded his cases. 5 documents, 5 separate boards, the old ritually, each one read aloud by the warden, each one signed and thumbed, no proxies, no aides, no exceptions. The first lantern. This world can kill you in ways you have not imagined. He signed it with a flourish, joking over his shoulder at Ockett, his bodyguard, about the famous mammalian flair for theater. The second lantern. Your wealth has no value below the cloud line. He signed that one without reading it at all, which would also come back to him later, on a cold beach, with great clarity. The third bound him to obey his warden's direct instruction in matters of survival. The fourth waived rescue priority. Lantern 5 worlds being places where rescuers die, the signature acknowledged that no one would be ordered to come for him. The 5th was a single line, the oldest of them, written before the standard had lawyers. The 5th lantern, you were warned. Cheerful people, your ancestors, Hesk said, handing back the stylus. They were still alive to write it, the human said, and stamped the boards, and that was the last thing anyone said until the skiff dropped. The party was 4, plus the pilot, Hesk, in expedition gear that had been tailored on Tessin and gleamed like a showroom. Ockett, his bodyguard of 20 years, a Dren mercenary built like a retaining wall, gray-hided, calm, carrying enough hardware to annex an island. Tess Calder, carrying a canvas pack that looked older than she was and a short, ugly, scratched warden's rifle that Hess gunbearer had visibly judged and found beneath comment. And in the cargo cradle, in a case of polished bonewood with the Vel Workshop seal inlaid in silver, the presentation rifle, 2 meters of cold elegance. The cost of a frigate, engraved along the barrel with a hunting prayer in High Sarathi that Hesk had commissioned and never read. The pilot was a lodgeman named Vansel, cheerful and quick, who had flown the private corridor twice before for clients in a hurry and winked at Ockett as the skiff dropped out of the bay. Smooth as glass, big fellow, the blooms all forecast and no fact. We'll have the magnate on the flats by breakfast. For 19 minutes he was right. The bloom did not look like weather when they met it. That was the thing the recordings never conveyed. Hesk would think afterward, when thinking about it could still make his plume stand. It looked like the air itself had curdled, a wall of gold-gray haze off the estuary mouth 50 kilometers wide, lit from inside by the morning sun until it glowed like something holy. Spore-mast pollen, a few billion tons of it, as the human had said. Every grain a perfect little engineered horror of hooks and oils, 300 million years of evolution dedicated to sticking to everything and dissolving into anything warm. Vansel saw it and banked east. The corridor, the private, paid for, imaginary corridor, ran straight through the northern lobe of it, and he did what any pilot does with a paid-for plan and a client behind him. He tried to thread the gap. The skiff's lifters breathed through filters. The filters were rated for dust, ice, ash, and sand. There is a document, somewhere in the lodge's files, in which a manufacturer's representative confirms in writing that no rating exists for Coldbrook's spore-mast in bloom season because no sane operator flies in it. The port lifter choked at 4,000 meters. It did not explode. That would have been quick. It clogged, surged, shrieked like a kettle, and began to die in stages, and the skiff fell out of the sky the way a coin falls down a well, in long wobbling, recoverable-looking spirals that were never quite recoverable. Hesk remembered the cabin lights going amber. He remembered Ocket's arm coming across his chest like a dock crane, pinning him into the crash frame before his own hands had found the buckles. He remembered the human, 2 seats forward, not screaming, not praying, but talking, flat, clear, unhurried, into her collar beacon, giving a position, a heading, a rate of descent, repeating it, while the world in the viewport turned from sky to haze to a vast gray-green smear of tideland rushing up. He remembered thinking absurdly, with the last coherent vanity in him. Not like this, I have a wager. The skiff hit the drowned miles at a shallow angle, which is the only reason this story is longer than 1 chapter. It struck the outer flats where the receding tide had left a kilometer of wet sand, bounced once, a full, floating, weightless second in which nobody in the cabin breathed, came down again on the dying port lifter, sheared it off, spun, dug a wing into the sand, and cartwheeled. Metal made sounds metal should not make. The cargo cradle came off its rails and went through the cabin like a thrown drawer. Something white and enormous bloomed in front of Hesk's face. Crash foam. And the world went soft and dark and very loud, then merely dark, then quiet. He woke to gray daylight through a torn hull, the taste of copper, and the sound of the sea. The human's voice, somewhere to his left, in the same tone she had used for the tide tables. Wiggle the toes first. Both feet good. Fingers good. Now your neck slow. Hands at his crest, his throat, his spine, small hands, quick impersonal as a custom scan. Bruised, not broken. You're luckier than you deserve. Sit still. Oakett, alive, his leg. A pause exactly as long as a fact needs. Vansel's dead. The pilot had gone out through the canopy when the wing dug in. They found him 40 meters up the flats, and there is nothing more to say about that except that Tess Calder closed his eyes with 2 fingers and stood over him for the length of 1 slow breath, and that Andevar Hesk, who had attended the funerals of senators, looked away first. The skiff lay broken-backed in the sand like something washed up, which, in every sense that mattered, it was. Ockett had dragged himself out of the wreck on his arms, hauling his shattered leg behind him, and propped himself against the hull with his sidearm already drawn and aimed at the tree line a kilometer away, because he was a professional, and professionals do not need to be told what kind of world they have just fallen onto. The leg was wrong below the knee in a way Hess could not look at directly. The Dren's gray face was the color of wet ash, and his voice, when he spoke, was a careful imitation of his normal voice. Magnate, apologies, I appear to be furniture. Hesque stood in the wreckage of 200 million crowns worth of expedition and did what 40 years of boardrooms had trained him to do. He took command. It shames nothing to record that he did it well, in the only language he had. He inventoried their assets aloud. He assigned priorities. He instructed the human to activate the emergency beacon and establish contact with the lodge, informed her that a recovery skiff would be dispatched within the hour, and noted that Sorek would be made to personally crawl down the corridor of his own lodge for this, which seemed to Hesk a plan and a good one. The human let him finish. That, too, he would remember. She did not interrupt, did not argue, just went on doing things with her hands the whole time he talked, pulling cases out of the wreck, cutting webbing, stacking, sorting, her eyes doing a slow circuit every 30 seconds, tree-line, flats, sky, sea. When he was done, she straightened up and gave him the situation the way you would read a manifest. Beacon's dead, sir. So is yours and his and mine. The bloom got into the wreck before we stopped rolling. Sporemast oil eats gasket polymer, and every transmitter on this skiff breathed it for 19 minutes. I might get the short range working in a few days if I can find clean parts to strip.
Might.
She nodded at the sky, where the gold-gray haze sat over the coast like a lid. Nothing flies through that for a week, maybe 2. Nothing will be looking here anyway. The flight plan. The flight plan says we landed at Pad Mori, 300 kilometers south of here, behind the weather line. Her voice did not change at all, and that was somehow worse than the words. You bought a private corridor, sir. Private means off the books. When we don't check in tonight, the net will start looking for us exactly where the books say we are. They'll grid search the Mari district for 10 days before anyone thinks to doubt the paperwork, and the lodge will be slow to correct them, because correcting them is a confession. The sea sounded very large. Somewhere behind Hesk, Oakett shifted against the hull and said nothing in a way that filled in all the arithmetic. Then we wait here, Hesk said. Shelter at the wreck. Standard doctrine. The wreck is visible from the air. It has supplies. It has about 4 hours, the human said. Tides turned. Everything you can see that's flat and wet is the bottom of the sea twice a day. By dark, there'll be 3 meters of water where you're standing, and by midnight, the wreck will be half buried in sand, and tomorrow it won't be visible from the air or anywhere else. That's why they're called the drowned miles, sir. It's not poetry. She shouldered the old canvas pack and looked at the two of them, the magnate with his crest fouled flat with crash foam, the bodyguard who would never walk unaided again, the bonewood rifle case lying in the sand between them with its silver seal catching the gray light. And Andivar Hesk watched her do the same arithmetic he had built an empire doing, the cold mathematics of weight and value and distance, and he understood with sudden total clarity that he was no longer the most important being on this beach. He was cargo. He had a wager somewhere above the clouds and a fortune in 4 banks and a moon, technically, and on the wet sand of the world he had bought a license to conquer. Every crown of it weighed exactly nothing. Warden called her, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. What do we do? If she enjoyed it, nothing in her face showed it. She was already moving, already cutting webbing into straps, already building, out of a wrecked skiff and a dead man's cargo net, the thing they would need. We get him off the flat, she said. Then we walk. The first lesson of Coldbrook was the weight of another being. They built the drag litter out of the skiff's cargo net and 2 struts cut from the wing, and Ockett went onto it with his teeth set and his sidearms still in his fist. And then there was a kilometer of wet sand between them and the shell ridge above the tide line, and the human looked at Andivar Hesk and held out one of the litter straps. He took it. He wishes it recorded that he took it instantly with grace. He did not. There was a full second. He counted it many times afterward, lying awake, in which the magnate of Hesk Orbital Holdings looked at the strap and looked around the empty gray coast for someone whose job it was, and found the coast unmoved, and the human already pulling, and the water already sliding up the outer flats in long silver sheets faster than a being could comfortably watch. He took the strap, he put it over his shoulder the way she showed him, leaned into it the way she showed him, and hauled. Ockett weighed 240 kilos without his hardware. They kept the hardware, she insisted, which surprised Hesk until he understood the place well enough to know that on Coldbrook you abandon food before you abandon iron. The sand gave under every step. The straps found nerves in Hesk's shoulders that money had kept him from ever meeting. A third of the way in, his legs began to shake. Halfway, his vision grayed at the edges, and the hunting prayer on the Veil rifle occurred to him like a bad joke. And at no point this was the part that worked on him, deep down where the mergers lived. At no point did the small gray-haired mammal on the other straps slow down, speed up, breathe loudly, or look at him to see how he was taking it. She pulled like the tide came in, on schedule, without comment, as a fact of the world. They cleared the last of the flats with the water at their heels, swirling around their boots in cold, businesslike pulls, and came up onto a ridge of broken white shell 10,000 years deep, and Hesk fell down on it and lay there with his crest in the dirt and his lungs full of knives, and was for the first time in 4 decades, nothing and nobody, a creature breathing. Good, the human said, above him. It was not praise, it was a box checked. Rest is over. We need fire before dark, and you need to learn it, because I won't always be the one making it. The tents had died in the crash with everything else that had a brain. His expedition gear, the Tessin tailoring, the self-heating shelter with its climate memory, the field kitchen that knew his preferences. All of it was either crushed in the wreck or fouled. With spore oil, and the oil, she explained, while her hands built a fire the way other beings' hands write their names, never came off. It soaked in. It waited for heat. A heating element wrapped in spore oil was a slow lamp at best and a flare at worst. And so the magnate's camp that first night was the human's camp, a tarp older than her coat, strung low and taut between driftwood stakes, angled to the wind. A fire of salt bleach wood inside a ring of shell, and the smell, which Hesk would have paid to escape and learned instead to love, of smoke and iodine and wet stone. The fire mattered more than he knew. Sarathi are a high-altitude species from a dry world. Their plumage is glorious and their cold tolerance is a rumor. Wet feathers on Coldbrook's coast were not a discomfort. The human told him flatly, they were a deadline. She showed him how to dry the crest by the fire in sections, lifting each rank of plumes with a stick so the heat got to the down beneath, and he sat there in the firelight being groomed like livestock by the smoke, the most expensive feathers in 3 systems steaming gently over a driftwood blaze. And across the fire Ockett watched with his ruined legs splinted straight and laughed once quietly before he could stop himself. Say it, Hesk told him. Forgive me, magnate. In 20 years I've never once seen you do something for the first time. The rations were the second war, and Hesk lost that one too. His hampers had survived. Bonewood travels well, and on the first night he had Ockett's aid case opened and began by reflex to allocate the cured delicacies and pressed fruits to himself and his man, the dense gray expedition blocks to the human, a fair division by every instinct he possessed. The owner eats the owner's food. The human watched him lay it out, then crouched, repacked all of it into one pile, and split the pile 3 ways by weight and calories with a few moves of her knife. Everything goes in the pool, she said. Your fancy tins are calories. My blocks are calories. Tonight, nobody on this coast is rich. Those tins, he said, with the gentleness he used on small competitors, are worth more than your annual salary. Not here, they're not. Here, they're worth about 2 days. She held out his share, his own pressed fruit, rationed back to him by a being he could have bought 1,000 of. Eat slow. We're 40 days from anywhere, and we'll be hungry for 35 of them. He ate slow. He did the figures while he ate, because figures were what he had instead of skills. 110 kilometers of coast between this fire and the lantern relay, the manned beacon station at the north hook of the bay, the only door off this shore with the bloom sitting on the sky. 3 to 4 kilometers a day, she said, dragging a litter over tide-cut ground, if the weather was kind, which it would not be. Call it 30 days. The food in the pool, stretched mean, was 22. The gap, he said, concerns me. The coast feeds people who know how to ask, the human said. I know how to ask. The gap's not what should concern you. What should? She looked out past the fire, at the dark where the flats had been, where the sea was now sliding over the place the skiff had died. The night was full of small sounds that Hesk's expensive ears could not classify, and one absence of sound somewhere out there that he could not have pointed to but felt on his skin like a draft. Tomorrow, I'll show you, she said. Dry your feathers, sir. Sleep close to the fire. From here north, we're walking through somebody's pantry, and I'd rather tell you about him in daylight. She told him in daylight. They went back down at low tide to strip the wreck. Clean wire for the dead beacons, gasket stock, anything the spore oil hadn't kissed, and they found the wreck already visited. The sand around the broken hull was pocked with prints, and the prints were the size of dinner platters, 5-clawed, webbed at the root, pressed 15 centimeters into ground that barely took Hesk's heel. Something had walked around the skiff twice, unhurried, in the black of the falling tide. Something had then peeled the cargo hatch, peeled it, the alloy folded back like foil, and gone through their stores with terrible neatness, taking the protein, all of it, and leaving the rest. And something had found the place up the flats where they had buried Vansel above the tide line, under a cairn of shell and stone, and had dug, and the grave was empty. Hesk stood looking at the empty grave for a long time. Grayback, Tess Calder said, old male. There's only one this stretch of coast they don't share. 1,200 kilos or so by the prints. She crouched, laid 2 fingers in one of the tracks the way Hesk had seen brokers touch fabric. The wardens call him the deacon. He collects. The animal I came to kill, Hess said. The animal you came to kill, she agreed, with nothing at all in her voice. Found your scent before you slept your first night on his ground, took your protein, and dug up your dead. I want you to look at the door of that hatch, sir, and understand the wager you made over drinks. Hesk looked at the folded alloy. The Vale rifle could kill such an animal. The ballistics were real even if nothing else about the expedition had been. The ballistics needed a shooter who could see the animal, and the door said, in plainly folded metal, that the animal decided who saw him, and when, and from how far away. 11 permits, 11 refunds. He thought of the drawer. He'll follow us, Hesk said. It came out of question. He had not asked questions in decades. They kept escaping him on this coast. He'll pace us. She straightened, eyes doing the circuit, tree line, flat, sky, sea. Grayback's shadow wounded herds. They're patient like rocks are patient. We have a litter and a blood smell that won't quit. She did not gesture at Oket. She didn't need to. He'll walk our flank for days, maybe the whole way, and take what gets loose. The answer is nothing gets loose. We keep the camp tight, the food hung, the fire fed, and we do not bleed where it costs us. That night the lesson was fire watch. And the third war began, and this one Hesk did not so much lose as forfeit publicly in a way that changed the shape of the column. It was Ocket who broke the camp's discipline, which no one had foreseen, least of all Ocket. The Dren had spent 20 years being the competence beside the throne. Immobility was acid on him. In the gray hours on his watch, propped against the driftwood with his sidearm and his sectors, he saw the dark move at the edge of the firelight, and it had moved. The prince in the morning would show that much. The deacon had come in with the land breeze behind him and stood 40 meters out, watching the camp with the flat patience of his kind, and Oket did what every professional instinct in him was built to do. He put 6 rounds into the dark. The dark received them without comment. The camp came up out of sleep into chaos. Hesk tangled in the tarp, shouting, demanding the situation. Fire scattered, embers in the wind, and the human was on Ocket's gun arm with both hands and her whole weight before the 7th round went out. Her voice the only level thing left in the world. Stop, stop, he's gone. He was gone before the 2nd shot. I had movement. Ocket's breath was ragged with pain and adrenaline. Confirmed movement sub 50 meters. You had him, she said. And you spent 6 rounds teaching him what guns are, and he now knows they make noise and light and don't reach him in the dark. That was the most expensive lesson on this beach, and you gave it to him for free. She let go of the arm. In the firelight, her face was the same as it had been over the tide tables, over the lanterns, over the dead man, and Hesk found that he had begun to read the flatness the way one reads heavy weather. How many rounds left? All weapons. The count was done by firelight. Ocket's sidearm. 9. His long gun cracked at the receiver in the crash, salvageable for parts. The warden's ugly, scratched rifle. 20 in a belt loop, kept where they had always been. And in the bonewood case with the silver seal, untouched, magnificent. The veil and 40 rounds of presentation ammunition that had been loaded by hand on Tessin by a master who had never once imagined them being fired in fog at night wet. From tonight the ammunition lives in one place, the humans said, and it's my pack. Nobody fires on this coast unless I say fire or I'm dead, in which order you should hope stays theoretical. Sergeant, and that was its own small surgery. She had read Ocket's old service ink off his forearm days before anyone mentioned it. Your watch. Stands. Your sector stand. Your trigger is mine. Can you live there? The silence had Hesk's bodyguard in it, and 20 years, and a leg that would never carry a charge again, and 6 rounds that could not be unspent. Ocket looked at her, this small graying mammal who had hauled him a kilometer through wet sand without breathing hard, and Hesk watched the soldier, in him take the new chain of command the way soldiers take true things. I can live there, Warden. Good. She picked up the scattered fire, log by log, with her bare hands quick among the embers. Then everyone sleep. We make the river mouth by the 3rd day, and the river mouth is his church, and I want us through it before he finishes thinking about us. But Andivar Hesk lay awake in the smoke with his crest pressed flat under the tarp, listening to the sea claim the flats, doing the only arithmetic left to him. 29 rounds held by a human who told magnates no. 22 days of food against 30 days of coast. 1,200 kilos of patience somewhere to their north, walking his property line, waiting for something to get loose. And the item that would not leave the ledger, the entry he kept rereading in the dark. Every search skiff in this hemisphere was grid-walking a district 300 kilometers south, because Andivar Hesk had paid good money, paid a fortune, paid with relish, to make absolutely certain that nobody in the universe knew where he was. He had built the trap himself. He had signed it. 5 times you were warned, the 5th lantern said in the oldest human script. And on the 2nd morning of his new life, the magnate got up before he was called, rolled the tarp the way he'd been shown, took his strap of the litter without being handed it, and began in the manner of beings everywhere who have finally met an invoice they cannot dispute to pay. The coast went north in long gray teeth. That was the shape of the days, ridge and slough, shell bank and bog, every headland a climb over black rock with the litter passed hand to hand, every river a council of war. The tide owned the clock. They moved when the flats bared and camped when the sea came back, and the rhythm got into Hesk's blood within 3 days the way no schedule of his own design ever had. There is no negotiating with a clock that drowns you, and something in him that had spent 40 years negotiating found the absoluteness of it almost restful. The work was the worst thing his body had ever been asked to do. His shoulders bled under the straps, then calloused. His tailored boots came apart on the 4th day. The human rebuilt them around his taloned feet with wreck webbing and tide cord, and they were ugly, and they held, and he caught himself weeks later prouder of those boots than of the moon. Ocket navigated. It was the human's idea, and Hesk understood only slowly what she had done with it. The Dren couldn't walk, couldn't fight, couldn't stand a watch on his feet, and was beginning, in the silences, to do the arithmetic of his own weight. Every kilometer of him hauled, every calorie of him fed, on a coast where the math was already losing. She took the salvaged charts and the warden's hand compass and put the whole route in his lap. Tide tables, bearings, camp selection, water sourcing. I've walked this shore 30 years, she told him. I don't need a navigator. I need a navigator I can argue with. From that morning, Ocket held the column's brain in his lap and called the halts, and the crossings and the silences stopped, and Hesk, watching, filed away the first management lesson anyone had given him in 20 years that he actually intended to use. Weight that believes itself dead drops itself. You keep it alive by loading it. The coast fed them, as promised, though it fed them on her terms and at her prices. She read the shell banks like a commodities board. She set tide lines at dusk, hooks of bent wreck wire baited with sandworm, and hauled silver, ugly thrashing protein out of the dawn shallows. She knew which kelp bladders held fresh water, and which held a purgative, which mudflat hummocks were eggs, and which were jellies that ate inward, and she taught all of it as they walked, flatly, repeatedly, in the tone of a being stocking a shelf she expected to be audited on. You're not learning this for interest, she said, when Hesk observed once honestly that the lecture series alone was worth a university chair. You're learning it because I'm one rock slip from being luggage like the sergeant, And the day that happens, this column's warden is whoever learned the most. Eat the green ones, the red ones eat you. The deacon walked with them the whole way, on the inland flank in the manner of a debt. They never saw him whole. That was the thing Hesk could not have explained to the trophy hall. 40 guests under bone chandeliers, toasting ballistics, that an animal of 1,200 kilos could spend 11 days inside a kilometer of them and never once offer a silhouette. They saw his ledger instead. Prints inside their dead campsites, mornings after, pressed neat among their own. The tide lines rated with surgical contempt, hooks bitten off above the bait, a shape at the edge of vision at dusk that was always, when Hesk spun, a rock. And the rocks, the human pointed out without comfort, did not usually steam in the cold. Twice, in the black hours, a sound came off the inland bog that was not a roar, nothing so theatrical, but a long, low conversational rumble, like a door asked to move after years of paint. And both times every animal sound on the coast stopped at once, the whole dark holding its breath, and Hesk lay in that universal silence, understanding in his skin what apex meant, and that he had paid 200 million crowns for the privilege of being on the wrong side of the word. "Why doesn't he come in?" he asked. On the 6th night, he had firewatch. He had firewatch now, a thing that would have required notarized proof in the trophy hall, and the human was awake beside the embers rewrapping Oket's splint, and the rumble had come and gone an hour before, closer than the bog. "We're slow. We're 3. He took a hatch off a skiff. The fire can't be more than a nuisance to a thing that size. Why does he wait? 'Cause waiting works." She tied off the wrap, checked the Dren's toes for warmth, moved to the next thing the way she always moved to the next thing. Everything on this coast that charges dies young. He's old. You don't get old here by being brave. You get old by being right. He's been right for 30 years. She looked out at the dark, and there was something in her face Hesk had not seen aimed at any living thing before. Not warmth, exactly. Respect of the working kind between professionals. He's waiting for the coast to do his work. It usually does. And if it doesn't, then around the time we're weakest, he'll stop waiting. She banked the fire and rolled into her blanket. "Sleep after your watch, sir. The river mouths tomorrow." The river was called the Ostler, and it came down out of the inland forest in a brown half-kilometer of moving authority, and the only way north was through it. They reached it at mid-morning of the 7th day and stood on the south bank while Oket worked the tide tables, and the news was the kind Hesk had learned to expect from this coast. The crossing was possible for 40 minutes at the bottom of the ebb, when the river spread thin over the bar at its mouth, hip-deep on a human in the deepest channel, and at every other hour of the day it was a death by water of one kind or another. The bar was open ground, half a kilometer of it, with the sea on one side and the forest on the other, and no cover taller than regret. "He knows this bar," the human said. She was cutting rec cord into harness lengths as she talked, her hands as usual 2 sentences ahead of her voice. "Every herd that moves this coast crosses here, at ebb, because there's nowhere else. Which means every grayback that ever held the drowned miles made his living within sight of where we're standing. It's the best ambush ground on 400 kilometers of shore, and we're going to walk across the middle of it at exactly the speed of our slowest litter." "You're telling me he's watching the bar," Hesk said. "I'm telling you that if he isn't, he's the first one in 30 years. She knotted the last harness and looked up. "We cross at the bottom of the ebb in order roped. Sergeant and the litter in the middle. You're on the upstream ropes, sir. I'm downstream with the rifle. We do not stop on the bar. Whatever happens, the column keeps walking. Standing still in a crossing is how you give a current and a predator the same gift, which is time." Then she roped him. That was the word for it. There was no other. She harnessed Endovar Hesk, magnate of the Tessin exchange, into the line between the litter and herself like the second-best pack animal in a string, checked his knots with 2 pulls, took his beautiful taloned hands and closed them on the rope and said, "Your job is wait. If the litter swings, you're the post it swings against. You don't fight the river sideways, you let the rope do it. Clear?" 20 years of subordinates would not have recognized the voice with which Endovar Hesk said, "Clear." The crossing took 11 minutes and aged him more than the crash had. The ostler at slack ebb was still a live thing, brown and cold and shouldering at his legs with the dumb insistence of money in a panic, and the bar underfoot was not sand but a moving carpet of pea gravel that swallowed each boot a little and gave it back reluctantly. And the litter did swing twice, Oket riding it with his 9 rounds drawn and his face entirely calm, a soldier resigned to being freight, and twice the rope came taut against Hesk, and he was the post he held, leaning into the harness with the water combing past his hips and his whole overpriced skeleton discovering exactly what it was for. He was mid-river, at the lowest point of the bar, when the herd came out of the forest. They were called shag elk on the warden maps, the human told him later. What came out of the tree line that morning was a wall of wet brown bodies, 60 or 80 of them, pouring down the north bank in a panic too total to be about the column. Animals that size do not run from three beings and a litter. And behind that understanding, arriving in Hesk's body before it arrived in his mind, came the only possible cause. And the cause was the deacon, and the deacon was driving them. And the deacon had chosen the moment of the ebb when the slow herd of three was nailed to the middle of the bar. Walk, the human said, not screamed. The voice cut through the river noise like wire through cheese. Walk. Eyes on me. Let them come. They'll split around the rope. The herd hit the river above the bar in an avalanche of spray, and the world for some seconds was legs and foam and the smell of terrified animal, a brown sea parting around the column close enough that Hess could have laid his hand on the heaving flanks as they passed, the rope thrumming, the litter rocking, Okit roaring something dren and delighted, and Anduvar Hesk stood post in the middle of a stampede on a drowned river bar and walked, one boot, the next boot, eyes on the small gray-haired mammal downstream who stood in the white water with the scratched rifle high and dry, across her chest, reading the chaos the way he read markets. And he had to think, with a strange soaring clarity in all that thunder. She knew. She built the column for this. Weight in the middle, posts on the ropes. She had us braced for the ambush before we ever got our feet wet. And then the shape came out of the spray at the tail of the herd, headed for the litter, and it was not brown. He never assembled the whole animal after. Nobody does, the wardens say. The survivors all describe pieces, because the mind refuses the full quotation. A gray shoulder higher than a cargo door sheeted with water. A head like a bridge footing, low level. Incoming. The wake it pushed. That was the detail that stayed in Hesku's sleep, a bow wave hip-high running ahead of it across the bar, the river itself announcing the bill due. What happened in the next 4 seconds happened in the order the human had built it to happen, which is the entire art of her species, and the reason the galaxy tells stories about them and the tone it uses for weather. She did not fire at the head. She fired ahead of it, one round, placed into the gravel bar at the exact point where the deacon's charge would cross from deep water onto bad footing, and what she had spent 6 days knowing it would do, what Okit's 6 wasted rounds in the dark had taught the animal a gun does. It made noise and light at a place. 1,200 kilos of committed mass met one small detonation of gravel and 30 years of being right. And the deacon did what old things do at surprises. He checked. Half a stride, a flinch of the bridge footing head, the charge bending a degree off its line, and the rope was already moving, because she had never stopped walking. None of them had. The column was 4 meters further north than the point the charge had been computed for, and a degree of bend and 4 meters of error put the deacon's strike not through the litter but behind it, a mountain of gray hitting the river where Okit had been 6 seconds ago, throwing a sheet of brown water over the whole column. Close enough that the smell of him, low tide and old blood and something sweetly rotten, the smell of a thing that collects, arrived with the spray. Walk, the humans said, third time, same voice, they walked. The deacon stood in the river behind them, hawk-deep, streaming, enormous, and did not pursue, because the math had moved and he was old, and the old ones only spend on certainty, and Anduvar Hesk, posting up the north bank on legs made of telegraph wire with his crest plastered flat and his hearts hammering in his ears, looked back exactly once, and met, across 40 meters of brown water, the flat pale regard of the animal he had promised to a wall in a room with chandeliers made of bone, and understood that the wager had been accepted. Not by Suvrantolk. On the north bank, in the lee of the first rocks, the column stopped and shook in its various ways. Okit laughed for a while, the way his people do after contact, and then stopped abruptly and was sick. Hesk sat down without arranging to. The human reloaded the one spent round, looked the ropes over, looked the litter over, looked the sky over, and allowed the column 4 minutes by the count before her voice came back with the tide tables in it. It was Hesk, strangely, who couldn't let the moment lie. The crash had not done it, the grave had not done it, but something about the bow wave had opened him at a seam, and on the north bank of the Osler, hands still wired to a phantom rope, the magnate heard himself say, to nobody in particular, in a voice he did not recognize, I was going to shoot that from a blind after breakfast. He looked at his hands. They sold me a permit. There was a brochure. I know. The human said. I'm required to read them. She shouldered her pack, and what crossed her weathered face was as close as she had yet come to an opinion. The brochure calls him a trophy animal. 30 years I filed reports calling him the senior warden of the South District. Nobody's ever asked me which is true. She glanced back across the river, where the gray shape still stood in the shallows, watching its herd of 3 walk away. You're the first client who's ever met him properly. Congratulations, sir. He knows you now. The 8th day was the stair, and the stair was where the column changed shape for good. The charts called it Pelham's Stair, a black basalt headland thrown out into the sea like a dropped gate, 400 meters of it, with no beach around its foot at any tide that month. The only way north went over it. A warden's root up ledges and rakes on the south face, easy enough for legs, and on the north side a single long descent gully where the rocks stepped down in flat shelves, 4 meters at a time, to the next bay. Legs could do it, a litter could not. A litter had to be lowered shelf to shelf 11 times on rope, with a being's whole weight swinging in it over each drop. The human rigged it without drama. Because drama was a currency the column had stopped accepting, she put the anchors in herself, tested each one with her boots against the rock and her whole frame on the line, and then she did the thing Hesk had felt coming for 2 days without letting himself name it. She handed him the brake. "I'm lighter than you by half," she said. "If I hold the brake and the litter swings wrong, it takes me off the shelf, and then there are 2 of us in the bay. You're the weight on this coast, sir. Time you worked at your full rating. Hands like I showed you. The rope does the holding, you do the paying out. Slow is the whole job. I'll be on the shelf below, catching." So the magnate of the Tessin Exchange spent 4 hours that afternoon as a winch. It was the most absolute work he had ever done. 11 lowers, each one a complete fiscal year of attention, the rope creeping through his talon grip a centimeter at a time, Ockett riding the swaying frame below with his 9 rounds and his terrible patience, the sea exploding white on the rocks under all of it, unhurried, keeping its own books. On the 7th lower, the anchor shifted. Not failed, shifted, a finger's width, with a crack like a knuckle, and the rope jumped, and 240 kilos of dren dropped half a meter and stopped. Because the brake held, because the brake had been paying attention with every cell of a body that had once been bored in board meetings, and from the shelf below the human's voice came up flat and unhurried, "Good hold, reset behind the gray block and finish. You've got him. You've got him." Hesk finished the lower with his hearts going like rivets, and when Ockett swung in onto the shelf, the dren looked up at the small silhouette of the brake against the sky, and then at the human and said, conversationally, "Warden, in my professional opinion, you have ruined this being for the exchange. Nobody up there will ever again be able to tell him anything is heavy." On the last shelf but one, with the light going long and bronze and the bay opening out below them at last, she stopped the column, and was still for a moment, looking down, and Hesk followed the look and saw what the coast wanted them to see before it let them off the stair. The deacon was on the beach below, in the open, for the first time, out on the bared sand of the very bay they would have to camp in, gray and vast and gleaming in the low sun, standing over the tide line they would have to fish, not hunting, not hiding, doing nothing at all except being exactly where they were going. As they watched, he turned his bridge-footing head and looked up the gully, at the rope, at the litter, at the brake, held the look for the length of 3 waves, then walked without hurry into the sea, and was gone in a way that a thing that size had no administrative right to be gone. "He climbed the stair in his head while we did it on rope," the human said, in the voice other beings used for reading instruments aloud. "Counted us, weighed us, clocked our rate. Now he's told us he did it." She took the brake line back and coiled it, and her eyes stayed on the empty water. "That's not threat display, sir. Graybacks don't bluff. Bluffing costs. That was bookkeeping. He wanted us to watch him not bother." She shouldered the coil. "Camp's on the high shell tonight, double fire, and nobody fishes that line until I've walked it. School's moving up a grade." Hesk looked down at the long bare beach, at the prints, the size of dinner platters going down into the water, and located with some care the thing he was feeling because it was new stock, and he wanted it shelved accurately. It was not the river fear. That had been weather, an act of nature happening to him. This was worse and stranger, the sensation of being inside another mind's spreadsheet, a line item in a patient ledger kept by something that had been doing the mathematics of this coast since before Hesku had his first crest plume, and the strange, vertiginous, almost respectful recognition that he knew this feeling from the other side. He had been the deacon of the Tessin Exchange for 40 years. He had stood on beaches above smaller beings' roots and watched them work, and weighed them, and walked away without bothering, and called it diligence. "You're quiet," the human said on the way down. "I'm being audited," said Anduvar Hesk. "It's instructive from this end." The bloom came down off the heights on the 9th day and tried to kill them with softness. It had sat on the horizon the whole walk, the gold-gray lid that kept the sky empty of rescue, and Hesk had stopped seeing it the way one stops seeing a creditor's letters. Then the wind backed inland overnight, and at dawn the human looked at the light. The light had gone wrong, honeyed and thick, like late afternoon arriving at sunrise, and said the only obscenity Hesk ever heard her use quietly, and put the whole column under the tarp on the highest shell ridge in reach, with every container they owned filled with water, and the bloom arrived. Spore-mast pollen in open country is not a storm. It does not roar or strike. It descends endlessly, golden, almost gentle, a snowfall from a kinder world, and it sticks where it lands and builds, and breathes in through everything that breathes. And by the second hour, the air past arm's reach was a glowing amber nothing, and the tarp sagged with the weight of soft gold, and the world had been deleted in honey, cloth over every airway. The human cut and wetted the masks and showed them the rhythm. Breathe through the wet weave, swap, rinse, ring, again, and the rinse water turned to thin glue, and the day passed in golden dark to the sound of three beings breathing through rags, slowly, on a coast where slow breathing was the entire agenda. In the middle of it, Ocket's deep voice came through his mask, conversational. Warden, the transmitter parts, from the wreck. A silence under the tarp. In oilcloth, double-wrapped, center of my pack, she said. We'll know when it clears. They knew on the 11th day. The bloom passed, the wind came back off the sea and washed the world. The coast emerged from under the gold, looking rinsed and new, indecently beautiful, as though nothing on it had ever eaten anything. And Tess Calder sat on a rock with the oilcloth bundle and unwrapped, one fold at a time, the 2 weeks of patient salvage that had been the column's quiet hope. The stripped wire, the scavenged cells, the gasket stock, the half-built short-range set that might, at the relay's antenna mast, have raised the orbital net in an hour instead of a vigil. The outer cloth was clean. The inner cloth was clean. The third wrap, against the components, carried a fine gold dust that had ridden in on the wire itself days ago from the wreck, invisible until the bloom's humidity woke its oils, and the cells were furred with it, and the boards wept thin amber where the oil had found heat, and the column's radio was, and would remain, a kilogram of carefully transported grief. She looked at it for a slow 10 count. Then she wrapped it back up, all 3 folds, neat as a flag, and stowed it. Parts are parts, and took out the tide tables. And Hesk watched her recompute the whole shape of their survival in her head in the time it took him to understand what had been lost. No radio, the relay's own equipment then. Nothing between here and there but feet. 12 days of food at the cruel ration. 60 kilometers of coast. And the unspoken third column of the ledger, walking their flank, patient as geology, who had not been seen since the river and had not for 1 hour been gone. That night Hess did not sleep and gave up trying and crawled out to where she sat the late watch by the banked coals. He had been assembling the sentence for 2 days. It came out broken anyway. The corridor, he said. The flight plan. Sorek's clerk filed what I paid him to file, but the instruction was mine. The hold, your hold, the lawful one, I bought my way around it because a being I've despised for 40 years laughed at me in front of 40 others. The fire ticked. Out on the Black Flats, the sea moved its weight. Vansel is dead of it, your sergeant's leg, the radio. Every skiff searching the Maury district, 300 kilometers of error, that error has my seal on it. I am the author of this coast. His crest, what the weather had left of it, lay flat along his skull. I find I needed to say it plainly, to the warden of record, before whatever the next thing is. Tess Calder fed the fire a length of salt-silvered wood and was quiet the length of 3 waves. On this world we'd say it's simpler, she said. You bought the 5th lantern. Everyone who signs it thinks it's about the planet. She looked at him then, and her face by the coals was the same face as ever, and her voice had not moved a degree, and that was its own kind of mercy, the only kind on offer this far north of money. It's about the signature. You're not going to tell me it wasn't my fault. No, sir. You'd smell it for a lie, and we need you walking, not flinching. She set the stick down. Here's what I'll tell you instead. 11 days ago you were freight. Tonight you're the best rope post I've worked with in 10 seasons. Your watch is clean, your knots hold, and the sergeant's alive in large part because you haul like an animal twice your build. The being who bought that corridor wouldn't have lasted my coast a week. I haven't seen him since the river. She rolled a coal back into the ring with her boot heel. Court's still gonna want him, mind. The lodge will sell you the moment the paperwork surfaces, and paperwork always surfaces. I know it, Hesk said. I intend to be standing somewhere expensive when it does, saying it first. Then keep your watch and dry your feathers, said the warden of record, unrolling her blanket, because between you and that courtroom there's 60 kilometers of his parish, and he's not finished with us. Wake me at the turn of the tide. The lying cabin at Carrow Point was supposed to be the turning of the story, and the coast knew it, and arranged otherwise. It stood on the warden charts as a black square with a wood stack, a stove, a sealed cache of rations and medical stores, and the entry Ockett had circled twice on the chart with a blunt talon, a hand-crank signal lamp rated to reach the lantern relay's watchtower on a clear night. 3 days of brutal coast lay between the Bloom camp and the point, and the column spent them well. Hesk hauled and learned and stood his watches. The tide lines gave up their silver, and a thin, real thing that none of them named had begun to live in the camp at night, something adjacent to confidence. The cabin had been dead for a year. They smelled it before they saw it, old char on the wind, and came over. Last rise to find the black square on the chart was a black square, in fact, burned to its stone footings, roof beams collapsed in on the stove, and the cache, the buried steel cache with its ration blocks and its medical stores and its signal lamp, torn open from above, not burned, opened. The lid lay 40 meters off in the dune grass, folded at the corner, with 5 clawed punctures through 6 millimeters of steel. Lightning fire? Last dry season, the human said, reading the char the way she read everything. The cache survived that. She stood over the violated steel for a moment, and Hesk watched her add the date the way an auditor adds a column. He opened it after. He's been opening them. That's why the protein's always first. He's learned that the soft-shelled things on 2 legs leave food in boxes, and where the boxes are, and that more soft-shelled things eventually come back to the boxes. She looked up the coast, north toward the relay, and for the first time since the beach, Hesk saw her recalculate something twice. He's not pacing us because we're wounded, Sergeant. He's herding us up his trapline. The boxes are bait now. We're the resupply. The food at that point was 4 days at the cruel ration. The relay was 9 days coast. There's a fork in this, she said that night at the fire and laid it out with the tide tables, because she ran her column like a coast and not like a court. Every being got the figures. Inland, leave the shore, cut the big bend of the coast across the bog meadows, save 4 days distance, through soft ground that would fight the litter every meter, with no tide lines to fish and no driftwood to burn, betting everything on speed they might not have, or the coast. The known road, the feedable road, 2 days longer than the food, through every cache the deacon kept, with the animal himself somewhere between them and the door. Ockett voted inland on military grounds. Never walk the route the enemy has prepared. The human heard him out. Hesk noticed she always heard the sergeant out fully, which was half the reason the sergeant was still sane, and then put one weathered finger on the chart, on the bog, on a cluster of hatch marks no one had asked about. Sink meadows, bottomless some of them. The litter goes into the axles in the good stretches. And he knows the bog too, it's his summer range. Only in the bog we can't see him at 40 meters, and there's no fire that burns wet peat, and no tide to time him by. She moved the finger to the coast. Out here, the world's only got 2 directions and he has to cross open ground to reach us. I'll take hungry over blind. We go by the shore, we fish hard, we tighten the ration, and we stop walking like prey. She looked around the fire at her column of 2 convalescents and a plutocrat, and delivered the sentence that Hesk would quote years later to a chamber full of beings who had never been north of money. From tomorrow, we don't avoid his ground, we use it. He thinks he's herding us up his trapline. Fine, we're going to walk his trapline like we own it, eat his bait, and make every one of his boxes cost him. What followed was a small, cold, methodical war, fought up 60 kilometers of gray coast between a human who would not hurry and an animal who had never had to. She rotated their camps off pattern. Never the obvious ridge, never the same interval. Fires built and abandoned still burning at false sites while the column slept dark and cold a kilometer on. At the next 2 caches, both opened, both stripped of protein, both watched, she was certain. The way a fisherman watches a set line, she fed the deacon's expectation and poisoned it. The column arrived loud, camped square on the bait site, fires high, then slipped out at the black turn of the tide and was 4 kilometers north by the time the dawn came in over an empty camp and a banked blaze. Every time he commits to where we were, she said, he pays a night. Patience is a bank account. Old as he is, even his run's dry. They got to watch one of the payments once, and it bought them something colder than satisfaction. It was the 4th night of the trapline war. At the false camp below the Tully cache, fires built high on the obvious ridge, bedrolls mounded over driftwood, the column itself a kilometer north in the black lee of a shellbank, cold, dark, eating smoked tide catch in silence. Hesk had the middle watch, which meant he was the one lying belly down on the bank's crest beside the human when the southern fires moved. There was no sound at that distance. That was the obscene part, the part that stayed. A camp of 3 fires built by his own hands that afternoon, dying all at once, not scattered, killed. Each blaze blotted in turn by a moving piece of the dark, methodical as a being going down a corridor turning off lamps, and then the brief, total wrongness of the tarp and the bedroll mounds going into the air, high lazily, like things thrown by surf and falling, and the dark moving among them at leisure, taking the camp apart item by item with a thoroughness that was somehow worse than fury. It took 11 minutes. Hess counted them by his own pulse. When it was done, the dark stood quite still in the middle of the murdered camp for a long moment, and then the head came up and around and pointed through a kilometer of night directly at the shell bank. Beside him, the human did not move. Her hand had settled on his forearm 30 seconds in, not comfort, instruction, and it stayed there, light as a tide table, until the shape in the dead camp finally turned and poured itself back into the bog, and the night sealed over it. He knew before he finished. Hesk breathed. He knew where we were the whole time. He worked it out around the second fire, she agreed, barely a sound. Smell the age of the coals or the empty bedrolls or us on the wind eddy. Doesn't matter which. Here's your lesson, sir, and it's the last cheerful one I've got. He finished the job anyway. Killed the whole camp, slow, with us watching, and made sure we saw him look. She eased back off the crest, drawing him with her by the arm. I've sold him 3 empty camps now, and he's bought everyone with a night of his time, and tonight he told me what I get for it. Not safety, postponement. He's letting the coast starve us soft, and when he's done waiting, there won't be a trick left in my coat he hasn't already paid to see. In the starlight, her face was the flat working face, but her voice had something under it that Hesk had learned to listen for the way Ockett listen for wind shifts. We need that relay, and we need it before the food does the deciding. From tomorrow, we walk the long tides, both of them. Night legs. And his answer to night legs, he's a tide animal too, she said. His answer is he was already doing it. We're not stealing a march, sir. We're just declining to lose one. And the coast, as if it respected the effort, fed them barely. The tide lines gave. A seal thing hauled out dead on the 9th bar, and the human carved it like a market stall while Ockett kept the rifle on the tree line. The green kelp was everywhere once you hated it enough to see it. Hunger came anyway. Not the dramatic kind. The accountant kind. The kind that audits every motion. Heskey's tailored frame burned through its margins and started in on the principle, and the straps rode bone now, and he learned what his species textbooks meant by the cold debt. Sarathi metabolisms keeping flight muscle warm out of the calorie budget whether you ever flew or not. He did not complain. It was not virtue. It was that he had taken the measure of the 2 beings he walked with, and there was no complaint in the column's accounts, and a magnate knows better than to introduce a currency nobody honors. The 15th night was the gale, and the gale was the night the coast found out what it had made. It came in off the open sea at the top of a spring tide, a hard westerly that the human had been smelling all afternoon. She had moved the camp twice before dark, higher each time, grumbling at her own caution in a way Hesk had learned meant the opposite of caution, and at the black turn of the night the sea simply declined to stop where the charts said it would. Storm surge on a king tide, the one arithmetic even 30 years gets wrong by a meter. The water came through the camp not as waves but as a rising fact, fast, greasy with foam, and the night dissolved into the kind of minutes that do not happen in order when remembered. Hesk woke with the sea in his bedroll and the tarp coming down, and the fire dying its instant hissing death, and the dark was total, and the wind was a wall, and somewhere in it the human was shouting at last. The voice still flat, but pitched to carry through weather. A working voice, not a frightened one. That she had the sergeant, she had the litter. Get the packs, the food is the column. And here is the thing that Anduvar Hesk did, which the warden service teaches now, dryly, as a case study titled Assets, Reallocated. He did not flounder to her voice to be useful near authority, which is the drowning instinct of every executive and most species. He stood still in black water rising past his knees, in a gale in the wreck of the camp, and he ran the books. 2 packs, his and hers, upslope side, lashed. He had lashed them himself, her rule, every night, complained about silently every night. The tide catch, smoked, in the high cash bag on the driftwood post. Downstream now, gone or going. The rifle, with her always married to her shoulder, not his problem. The transmitter parts, the medical roll, the tide tables, her pack, Ockett's hardware lashed to the litter. The food is the column. He worked the rising dark like a balance sheet, by feel, by memory of his own lashings. And he came out of that water with both packs in the cash bag. He went downstream for the cash bag, into it, chest deep, because the arithmetic said 22 days minus the bag was a number nobody walked away from. And when the column reassembled on the high rock in the screaming dark, 3 beings and a litter and the whole ledger accounted for, the human looked at the bag in his grip for a long moment, water streaming off all of them, and delivered the only battlefield commendation of his career. Didn't tell you to do that, she said. No, said the magnate, don't do it again. A pause wind, the sea hammering the dark below them. Good count, though. They stood the rest of that night packed together on the rock like livestock, the 3 of them in the gale, taking turns being the windward body while Ockett ran the warmth rotation by his chrono because hands were too cold to feel time, and it was there, somewhere past the bottom of the night, with his back to the wind and a shivering Dren mercenary's shoulder under his arm and salt ice forming on what remained of his celebrated crest, that Anduvar Hess conducted, formally and in full, the audit he had been postponing since the beach. He inventoried his life by the line items the coast had taught him. Things that held when loaded, 2 packs worth, the strap, the brake, the count, the column. Things that did not. The entire remainder, 4 decades of it, an empire of leverage that could not have lifted one cash bag out of one tide. He thought about the trophy hall, 40 guests under bone chandeliers, every one of whom would have watched him drown reaching for the wrong assets, and about a small graying mammal who had moved the camp twice on a smell, and he understood, with the simple totality of a ledger finally balancing, that he had spent his whole life rich in a currency this coast did not accept, and that the conversion rate had been posted at the airlock all along, in 5 documents, and he had signed without reading. Toward dawn the wind backed and broke. The tide went out the way it always went out, indifferent to its own crimes, and the coast emerged gray and rinsed and new, littered with wrack and one drowned shag-elk calf a kilometer south, which the human butchered before full light because protein is protein, and which fed the column for 3 days, and on the wet rock and the first thin sun, Okit, blue-lipped, half-frozen alive, surveyed the magnate of the Tessin exchange, wringing out a bedroll with his ruined hands, and rendered the column's verdict on the night. Magnate, when we're home, I am going to tell the exchange what you did for a bag of smoked fish. They won't understand it, Hesk said. No, the Dren agreed, with profound satisfaction. They won't. Okit's leg made the choice about hurrying for them on the 17th day. The Dren had stopped reporting the leg, which the human said afterward was the tell she should have caught. Soldiers report pain right up until it becomes information for the enemy, and the only enemy in reach was the column's pace. The fever announced itself instead, Okit navigating them, mid-morning, onto a bar that the table said was 40 minutes from drowning, an error so unlike him that Tess Calder had the litter down and the splint open before he finished apologizing. The wound under the wrap had gone shiny and wrong, red runners walking up past the knee. What happened on the shell ridge that afternoon, Hesk did not have words from his own life to fit around, so he stored it whole. The human took her knife and the boiled wire, and the last of the antiseptic from her own kit, the cabin's medical cache being a year gone down an animal's throat, and she opened the sergeant's leg and drained it and cut away what had died, narrating the entire time in the tide table voice, because Okit was awake for it, there being nothing left to put him under with, and the narration was the anesthetic. This is expected. This next part is the worst of it. You'll feel pressure. Count the waves with me, Sergeant. Hesk knelt in the shell hash and held the leg of a being he had employed for 20 years and never once touched, and held the light, and when it was over and Okit lay gray and breathing in long, careful freight train pulls, the Dren rolled his head toward Hesk and managed, through the wreckage of his composure, Magnate, you're holding my leg. A pause, a long pull of air. 20 years I carry you. The world's gone upside down and I find I don't mind the view. Lie still, Sergeant, Hesk said. His own voice came out of strangers. That's an instruction from your employer. My employer, Okit said faintly, eyes closing, is the small one with the knife. You're the other rope post. And he slept, and the human looked across him at Hesk with the knife still in her red hands and said nothing, and did not need to, because the column's true table of organization had just been read into the record by its casualty, and every being on the ridge had signed it. The fever broke on the second night, which the human called luck, twice flatly, and it had cost them a day and a half of food they did not have, camped stationary on a known point, fires burning, blood scent on the wind. The arithmetic afterward was simple enough that nobody said it aloud. The ration was gone 2 days before the relay, even with the coast's charity. The litter was heavier by a convalescent who could no longer sit a half-day's haul, and the column was now exactly the thing she had spent 2 weeks teaching them not to be: slow bleeding, predictable, and pinned to the only road there was. The deacon, who had been a flank presence, an audit, a patience, moved up. The prince said it first. The morning they broke the fever camp. The platter-sized marks were inside the cold fire ring, not the camp margin. He had stood over them while they slept, between the banked coals and the litter for some long interval of the black hours, and had taken nothing, and left. The human stood in the ring reading the spacing of the prince for a full minute, and when she straightened up, Hesk, who could read her now, a little, the way one learns a foreign script, saw the thing he had never seen on her, and it was not fear, but it was fear's professional cousin, a deadline. He's done waiting, she said. That was him deciding we're worth it. He'll spend now, tonight, tomorrow night at the latest, at the worst ground he can arrange, which means the hook, because there isn't anything worse, and he knows we have to cross it. She kicked the dead fire apart and shouldered her pack, and her voice put the column into its marching order one last time. So here's the new plan. We stop walking to the relay like it's a finish line, because we don't get to finish at this pace, not all of us. We pick the ground first. We get to the hook ahead of him while we still have legs, and we set the table ourselves. She looked at Hesk, and in the gray morning light, the magnate watched 30 years of coast arrive in her face like weather. Sir, That presentation rifle of yours. The one I've been hauling 40 rounds for since the beach. Tell City about the trigger. The hook was the coast's last word on the subject of Mercy, a curved black headland a kilometer short of the lantern relay, where the shore pinched down to a single tide-bared causeway between cliff and sea, 200 meters of wet stone. Passable for 1 hour at the bottom of each ebb with the relay's white tower visible beyond it, lit, manned, warm, an entire civilization's worth of rescue standing in plain sight across the narrowest and most perfect killing ground on 400 kilometers of shore. They reached the cliff above it at dusk on the 19th day, on the last of the food, and looked down at the door home, and at the fresh platter-sized prints in the sand at both ends of the causeway, where the senior warden of the South District had walked his chosen ground over and over, in tight, patient, proprietorial loops, the way a being checks a table he has already set. There it is, Tess Calder said quietly, with something in her voice that in another species would have been called admiration. 30 years of being right, all walked into one beach. He doesn't need to find us anymore. He knows where we have to stand. She turned from the edge and began, with the last light, to unbuckle the bonewood case. Tonight we don't sleep much. Come here, sir, both hands. School's open. The veil came out of its case into the firelight like something embarrassed to be there. It was, Hesk had to concede, watching the human handle it, a beautiful machine under all the money. She stripped the silver fittings off it without asking. The presentation bipod, the engraved sight hood, the ceremonial sling with his house colors, and what remained when she had subtracted the price was a long, cold, honest instrument that had been waiting its whole pampered life for someone with calluses. She dry-cycled the action 100 times by the fire, learned its trigger the way she learned tide, and then she did the thing that told Hesk, finally and completely, what the night was going to be. She took the 40 hand-loaded rounds and buried 38 of them in her pack. 2 rounds went into the rifle. At the range I'm building, she said, to the question he hadn't managed to ask, if it takes more than 2, the rest were never going to matter. The school ran most of that night, in the wind shadow of the cliff, by the light of a fire kept small. Most of it was not about the rifle at all. It was about the mark. She painted it first, a handspan of pale clay slurry, on the black stone of the causeway, 60 measured meters from the notch, while the last of the ebb light held. And then she walked Hesk onto it and stood in front of him, taught him the only job on the coast with no tools in it, where his feet went, where his eyes went, low at the stone, never at the rocks, never at the notch, what his body would scream at him to do, in order as the weight came. And she named each one, the lean, the half-step, the turn, the way a physician names symptoms before a fever, so the patient knows the thing climbing through him is on the chart and survivable. You'll want to look at where I am. That's the one that kills you. The instant your head turns to the cliff, your shoulders follow, your line moves, and I'm threading a shot past a moving post into a moving animal. You hold and he comes straight, and straight is the only geometry I need. The mark is a promise, sir. I keep mine 60 meters up. You keep yours painted on the ground. Has anyone made that promise to you before? Hesk asked. And kept it? She was quiet for a moment, cleaning the veil's action in the firelight with a rag that had been a shirt of his that cost more than the rag would believe. Once, she said. My first season, warden named Porays drew an old female off a survey crew on the Maury Flats, and his rifle was a younger warden up a relay tower who'd never fired at anything with a heartbeat. He stood his mark like it was painted through to the planet's core. Afterward, I asked him how. Her hands worked the bolt, slow, sure, the firelight moving on 20 seasons of scars. He said fear was just the coast asking if you'd done the arithmetic. Said he'd done it, and the answer was the kid in the tower, so there was nothing left to discuss with the fear. I was the kid in the tower. She seated the bolt home with a sound like a ledger closing. He's keeper at South Light now. Sends me a list of everything I do wrong every year on my licensing review. Longest list in the service, he says. Proudest of that. And the arithmetic, Heck said. Tomorrow's, you've done it. Twice. Once on the tide, once on him. She set the rifle on the oilcloth and looked at the magnate across the small fire, and the look was the one from the staff rail, leveled and patient, except that 20 days had taught him to read what the flatness was holding, and what it was holding was the truth, offered whole, the way she offered everything. I won't lie to you on the night before, sir, so don't ask me for odds. I'll tell you what I know instead. He's old, he's committed, and he's never once seen a thing on this coast stand still that wasn't stone. Neither have I in 30 years. Tomorrow we both find out if you're stone. Hess looked at his hands, at the rope marks of the stair, and the strap-galls of the litter healing into something his tailor would have wept over. Sarathi lock rigid under enough terror, he said. Altitude reflex. My species file lists it as a deficiency. This coast grades on its own curve, said Tess Calder, and banked the fire. Sleep, sir. School's out. The rest is tide. The plan itself she had laid out at the start of that night, before the mark, before the school, and it was the coldest piece of work Andivar Hesk had ever heard a sentient being propose. And he had sat on pricing committees. It rested, she said, on the only three facts they owned. First, the deacon ambushed moving prey on the causeway. 30 years of bones down there said so, striking from the seaward rocks where the deep water let him stage with nothing showing but nostril and eye. Second, he was committed now, spending, done waiting. He would not let the column reach the relay. The causeway was his last and best table, and he knew it as well as they did. Third, and this was the hinge, the part she had been assembling since a folded steel lid in the dune grass, had learned the boxes. He had spent years learning that the two-legged things carried food, cached food, hung food in trees, slept beside food, that where the column was, the calories were. He trusted that lesson. It had never once been wrong. So we don't sneak the causeway, she said. We can't. He reads that ground like I read tide, and a column dragging a litter doesn't sneak anywhere. We give him the lesson he trusts instead. We give him the column on the causeway at the bottom of the ebb, right on schedule. Bait he's been promised for 20 days. She fed the fire, and the light moved on her weathered face, and Hesk listened to a being describe, in the tone of a freight schedule, the staking of her own species' oldest goat. Except the column that walks out there tomorrow is one tarp rigged over the litter frame, the sergeant's spare coat, your ruined tent stuffed with beach grass, and the last half ration of seal fat smeared on everything, dragged on a long line, slow, stopping and starting, by the only one of us strong enough to haul it against the current rip. That's you, sir. You're the column. And you, Hesk said. I'm in the cliff notch above the narrows with this, she touched the veil, and the first light of dawn behind me, 60 meters above the only rocks he can stage in. He commits to the decoy, he leaves deep water, and for about 4 seconds on the open stone he's broadside, slow and certain, the only 4 seconds in 30 years this coast will ever sell us. I take them, and if he doesn't choose the decoy, Ocket's voice from the litter gravel low, if he reads it, he has read everything else. The human was quiet for one wave too. Then he comes up the haul line for the post pulling it, she said, and the magnate drops the line and stands absolutely still on the mark. I'll paint for him, and trust me to be faster than a thing I have never once been faster than. She looked at Hesk across the fire, and there it was again, the thing from the lodge, the long, level look, the appraisal. But it had changed hands entirely, because this time what was being appraised was him, and this time he wanted to pass. I won't dress it up, sir. It's the worst job on the beach. It's bait that has to think. I'd take it myself, but I can't haul that sled against the rip and hold a 2-second group at 60 meters in the same morning, and the sergeant can't stand. There's no third arrangement of us. You can refuse. We'll think of something worse together. Andivar Hesk sat for a while in the firelight, in the wreck-cord boots, in the ruin of his plumage, at the smallest net worth of his adult life, and examined, with the cold faculty that was the one thing the coast had not taken, had in fact sharpened. The singular fact that the most dangerous being on this entire Lantern 5 death world was offering him a choice she did not offer herself. 20 days ago, he said, I'd have asked you what it costs and bought my way to the cliff seat. 20 days ago I'd have let you, she said. You'd have jerked the trigger, and we'd both be in him now. Paint the mark, said the magnate. Dawn on the 20th day came up off the sea the color of old iron, and the tide went out, and the goat walked onto the table. Hesk called. The decoy sled ground along behind him on its long line canvas and grass and seal fat, lurching and pausing the way exhaustion lurches and pauses, and the noise of it on the wet stone was obscene in the dawn quiet, and he made himself not look at the seaward rocks. That had been the last of the night's instruction repeated like scripture. You're a tired animal pulling food? Tired animals watch their feet. The moment you scan the rocks, you're a hunter, and he reads it. So Andivar Hesk watched his feet on the black stone of the causeway, 60 meters of cliff on his right hand with a notch in it. He did not look at either. The sea breathing on his left, close, oily calm at dead ebb, and he hauled his ridiculous freight at the center of the most honest transaction of his life. Himself at par, no hedge, no proxy. Collateral walking, he heard it the way she said he would, not a roar. Water, a single sheeting gush, the sound of a great volume of sea changing its mind, and then the stone itself under his boot soles announcing, wait, 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 in a rhythm too long to be anything with two legs. He did not turn. He dropped the line and stood on the painted mark and lived an entire fiscal quarter in each second. And what he was given to watch in lieu of his death was the seaside rocks 40 meters ahead, where the gray came up out of the dark water like the coast standing, vast and sheeted and gleaming, the bridge footing head swinging, not toward the sled. Toward him, he has read everything else, Ocket had said. The deacon had not survived 30 years of clever mammals by billing the obvious account. The animal came off the staging rocks onto the open causeway at a pace that made the river charge look like leisure, head low, mouth slightly open, and the open mouth was the whole world now. And somewhere very far away on the small dry margin of his mind, Hesk noted that he was not, after everything, going to scream, his species locked rigid under terror, an altitude reflex, and for once in its useless ornamental history the reflex was load-bearing, because the job was stand still, and his body had voted before his courage could be polled. Stand still. Trust the small gray-haired mammal 60 meters up with your frigate-priced rifle and her 30 years of being right. The first shot took the deacon at the base of the neck, quartering, precisely where the human had told the fire last night a grayback keeps the wiring between deciding and doing, and 1,200 kilos of decision lost its connection to 1,200 kilos of doing at a flat run on wet stone. The animal's front end dropped and dug. The back end paid out over it like a capsizing ship, and the whole gray mass came grinding, sliding, enormous, down the last 20 meters of causeway at Andivar Hesk standing on his painted mark, and stopped, with the bridge footing head 2 boot lengths from his unmovable, terror-welded feet. The sea breathed once. The deacon was not dead. One pale, flat eye, close enough that Hesk could see his own ragged silhouette standing in it, rolled and found him, and the great body gathered itself around its broken wiring with a patience that was horrible and magnificent. 30 years of being right refusing. The audit, the jaws shoveling against stone, 2 centimeters, 3. The second shot arrived from the notch in the cliff and was exact, and was final, and was, Hesk understood as the echo went out over the flat dawn water and came back off the headland, the only round of mourning the coast would fire, mercy, of the working kind, between professionals. Then it was very quiet, and the tide was coming, and Andivar Hesk stood alone on a causeway with the senior warden of the South District lying dead at his feet, and found that his legs had resigned, and sat down on the wet black stone before the body of the animal he had once promised to a wall, and did not feel, anywhere in himself, in any vault or ledger or sub-account, anything that resembled victory. She came down the cliff path with the rifle slung, checked Hesk with 2 impersonal hands, heart, eyes, the talon tips gone bloodless gray, and then walked to the body and stood over it the way she had stood over Vansel on the first morning, 1 slow breath, 2 fingers laid briefly on the vast gray brow, a debt of attention paid in full. If she said anything to it, the sea kept it. Tide's turning is what she said aloud to the column. We're the far side of the Narrows in 20 minutes, sir. Up. You can shake on dry land. It was Hesk, kneeling to take the haul line again with hands that would not entirely answer, who stopped and looked at the mountain of gray on the stone and asked the question that the trophy haul, the wager, the brochure, the bonewood case, and 40 years of acquisition had all been certain they already knew the answer to. The crest plate, he said. It's worth, there are beings who would. He stopped himself and stood there in his ruined boots and started over plainly, the new way. I don't want it. I find I'd rather starve a day faster than carry it. Is that madness? The human looked at him for a moment, and then she did the thing that 20 days of crash and tide and blood and bloom had never once produced. The thing the staff rail at the Gilded Blind would have sworn on contract law she was not equipped for. She smiled, briefly, like weather-breaking. That's the first thing you've said on my coast, said Tess Calder, that I'd have bought a permit to hear. She took up her side of the litter. He stays where the tide can reach him. It's how wardens go out, down here. Now haul, sir. Breakfast is at the relay, and I am sick to death of kelp. The lantern relay keeper, a human named Odell Brandt, who had run the White Tower alone for 9 years and talked, his colleague said like a man saving up, saw them come over the causeway hook at half-tide. 2 beings in a litter under a horizon of gray, one small and weathered and walking like the coast itself, one tall and ragged-crested and hauling like he'd been built for nothing else, and a third riding the litter with a rifle across his knees, alive all of them, out of a hemisphere's worth of empty. He had the kettle on before they reached the door because he was human, and the tower's log for that day reads, in its entirety, in the dry hand of a man who knew exactly what he was writing into the record of a Lantern 5 world. 3 walked in off the south coast. Warden, client, client's man. 20 days from the drowned miles. The coast kept the pilot and the deacon, fed them, called it in, note for the district. The South Parish is vacant. What happened above the clouds in the following hour has since been studied in 3 separate regulatory curricula as a case lesson in how fast an institution can move when it smells its own smoke. The relay's transmission went up through the bloom-scoured sky to the orbital net at mid-morning. The Hesk party, recorded by every manifest in the hemisphere as overdue out of Pad Mori 300 kilometers south, had walked into the Lantern relay from the north, off a coast no flight plan put them anywhere near. The duty controller read it twice and asked for confirmation. The second reading went out on the open channel, and the open channel is the open channel. Within 40 minutes, the search command had pivoted, the syndicates had opened files, 3 news desks on Tessin had woken their lawyers, and aboard the Gilded Blind, a clerk who had been paid to be sleepy was discovering that there is no fee schedule anywhere in settled space for being awake retroactively. Huntmaster Renosoric's statement of profound relief and institutional bafflement was released before the rescue skiff had even cleared the bay. It was a beautiful document. It survived 11 hours. It survived 11 hours because that is how long it took the rescue skiff to reach the relay, take aboard 3 survivors, and put them in front of a recorder. And for Andivar Hesk, magnate of the Tessin Exchange, gray crest, 12 kilos under his file weight, with his feet still in rec-cord boots because he had declined, twice, with courtesy, to take them off, to look into the lens with the flat calm of a being who had recently stood very still in front of something much worse than a board of inquiry and say it first. The flight corridor was falsified at my instruction. I purchased the violation of a lawful weather hold. The pilot Vansel is dead of the purchase. My guard is maimed of it. The search was misdirected of it. At a cost to this district I am told runs to 8 figures, every crown of which I will be repaying at the syndicate rate plus the warden surcharge. A pause, the old boardroom instinct for the room arriving, uninvited, and being put to honest work for the first time in its life. I am advised by counsel to say nothing. I have spent 20 days being advised by a better counsel. The world below us, there is a standard that says the guide's word is final on matters of survival. I am alive because that standard held even after I bought my way around it. The being who held it is named Tess Calder. Everything else in this statement is paperwork. It made, as the saying goes on several worlds, a noise. The Concord Tribunal sat 4 months later, on Tessin, in a chamber with very good acoustics and no windows, and it expected. The record makes this clear in a dozen small procedural ways. Defense, it had processed magnates before. It knew the liturgy, the regretted lapse, the rogue subordinate, the settlement offered like a tray of refreshments, the quiet understanding that beings who own moons do not in the end stand in the dock so much as lean against it. Andivar Hesk stood. He stood for 2 days, declining the chair the way he had declined to take off the boots, and the transcript of those 2 days has been excerpted so widely that beings who have never read a tribunal record in their lives can quote the spine of it. How he walked the panel, item by item, through the purchase of the corridor, names, figures, the hour of night, the exact wording by which being makes a bribe sound like logistics. How, when his own counsel rose to soften a point, Hesk thanked him, corrected the softening, and entered the harder version into the record himself. How the syndicate assessor, hunting for the usual exits, asked whether the magnate wished to invoke the doctrine of intervening catastrophe. Bloom, after all, being an act of the planet, and Hesk looked at her for a moment and said, "The bloom was forecast." The forecast was read to me aloud by a licensed warden whose hold I then paid to circumvent. The catastrophe did not intervene, assessor. It kept an appointment I made with it. And Howe asked at the close whether he wished to enter any mitigation at all before penalties. The magnate of the Tessin Exchange was silent for a moment, and then said the sentence that the wardens of 4 worlds now print, without attribution, inside the cover of the cadet manual. Mitigation is what I bought last time. I am here to pay the listed price. The listed price was historic, and he paid it the way the tide comes in, on schedule without comment. What the tribunal could not list, the feed said it for years afterward, in the tone of beings describing weather from another hemisphere, was that the defendant walked out of that windowless chamber with more standing than he had carried in, having performed, in front of the assembled credit of 3 systems, the single most expensive act available to his class. He had told the truth early, in full at retail. Tess Calder's deposition, taken by remote from the relay because the South District does not empty itself for tribunals, ran 4 minutes. Asked to characterize the defendant's conduct on the corridor purchase, she said, "He bought what was for sale. The selling's the part you should be sitting about." Asked to characterize his conduct on the coast, the record shows a 6-second pause, and then, "He hauled his share. Out here, that's the whole report card." Asked, finally, whether she wished to add anything regarding the deaths and injuries sustained, the warden of record looked into the lens from a white tower a hemisphere away, with the gray water moving behind her, and said, "Yes. Write down that the pilot Vansel flew the corridor because the client's money said to, and the huntmaster's pen said it was safe. Then check whose names are on your docket and whose aren't." The huntmaster's name was on the next docket. That tribunal took 11 days, and nobody printed its transcripts inside anything. The wager had died long before the tribunal, quietly 3 days after the rescue, in a hospital suite on the Gilded Blind with a view of the planet that Hesk had asked, specifically, not to be curtained. Suverin Tolk came in person, because 200 million is 200 million, and found his rival propped up in bed reading. Of all the documents in settled space, a planetary almanac, Coldbrook, tides, ranges, and working notes with a warden's stamp inside the cover. "You look terrible," Suverin said with feeling. "I'm told you met your trophy. I'm told you've come to collect." Hesk set down the almanac. "You'll have it by transfer tonight. The crest plate is on a beach where the tide can reach it, which is where it belongs, and you've never been more right about anything in your life than you were about that animal, though for entirely the wrong reasons, which I believe makes us even on the decade." He looked at his rival for a long moment, the crest stirring what was left of it, and Suverin Tolk, who had crossed 11 systems to gloat and was honest enough, in the privacy of his own ledgers to know it, found he could not find the seam to gloat into. "Suverin, you'll hear what I'm doing with the lodge before the exchange does. I owe you that for the drawer." What he did with the lodge reached the exchange at the opening bell and cost the Hesk Combine 4 points before lunch, which its chairman, by every account, never once checked. He bought the Gilded Blind outright. Sorek Syndicate sold fast and glad, the way one sells a building that has started to smell of subpoena, and he closed the client drops the same day. Not the lodge, the drops. The bone chandeliers still hang there, and the brass rails still gleam, and the viewing wall still turns with the slow green weight of Coldbrook. But no permit has been sold off that deck since, and the trophy hall has a different name now and a different traffic. It is the orbital station of the Coldbrook Warden Service, endowed in perpetuity, and the beings who ride its skiffs down the lawful corridors are warden cadets, supply runs, and the occasional syndicate auditor learning what the fifth lantern means from the only species qualified to teach it. The famous drawer of refunds Hess kept. It sits under glass in the entry hall where the wager was made, with a small plate that reads, in his own hand, 11 being to meet the warden of the South Parish. He refunded them. He did not refund me. Ockett never walked unaided again, exactly as the wet sand had promised. What the wet sand had not promised was what the Dren would do sitting down. He runs the cadet school on the converted trophy deck, 20 years of close protection and 20 days of being freight distilled into a curriculum that has been licensed by Warden Services on 4 worlds, and his first lecture to every class is delivered with the scarred leg propped on a chair and is titled, "The Cadets Do Not Laugh Until the End, and Then They Do Not Laugh for the Right Reasons." The most useful thing I ever did for my principal was break. Vansel was the account that could not be settled, and Hesk did not insult the debt by pretending otherwise. He learned because he asked. He had a staff of 40 who could have asked for him, and he asked that the pilot had a partner and 2 broodlings on a station over Maury, and that lodge pilots flew uninsured for the private runs, the off-ledger runs, the runs that paid double exactly because the paperwork did not exist. The pension he settled on the family was not the noise the feeds assumed. Pensions are just money, and Hesk had finally met the limits of the instrument. What he did besides was quieter and cost him more. He went to the station himself, alone, unannounced, in the rec cord boots, and sat in a small kitchen that smelled of recycled air and fried grain, and told Vansel's partner the truth at the same retail rate he had given the tribunal, the wager, the hold, the corridor, the 19 minutes, and then he sat with what came back at him, all of it for as long as it came, which was a long time, and did not once reach for the door or the checkbook. The partner's final word on him, relayed years later by a feed that expected something bitter, was this: "He's the only one of them who ever came up here and let it cost him something he couldn't write off." There is a small light on the Drowned Miles now, automated, solar, mounted on a basalt post above the spring tide line at the place where the skiffs bone surface in hard winters. The wardens did not ask who paid for it. The manifest says only private endowment, perpetual. It is not a navigation aid. Nothing navigates there. It burns at night anyway, one steady point on 400 kilometers of dark coast, and the warden cadets are taught what it marks. And the lesson attached to it is 1 sentence long and is the whole of the off-ledger corridor. Problem and its solution. Somebody flies what you pay for. The galaxy, being the galaxy, made its stories out of all of it. The feeds ran the causeway shot for a season, 60 meters, 2 rounds, the numbers doing the work numbers do. And the syndicates rewrote their clauses. And somewhere in the long fallout, a Tessan anchor coined a phrase that traveled badly and stuck anyway. The Deathworlder's discount, meaning the price of anything once a human has told you what it actually costs. Hesk heard it at a reception, from a being who had not noticed him listening and laughed once quietly into his glass. They had it almost right. They always have it almost right. The discount isn't a price. It's a tide table, he wanted to tell the room. It doesn't negotiate, it doesn't care who you are, and if you read it honestly, it will let you live there. But he had given up correcting rooms mostly. It was a long way around to a short truth, and he had learned the short way, and the short way was a coast. He went back, of course. That is the part the feeds never understood and the part that matters. He went back the next year in the same season when the spore-massed bloom stood gold on the horizon and the lodges of 3 systems found their calendars quietly empty. He filed a lawful plan down a lawful corridor, and he signed the 5 lanterns at the airlock one at a time, reading each one aloud in High Sarathi and then in the human script, because the cadet running the boards was new and nervous, and he wanted the ritual done properly in front of her. At the 5th board you were warned. He paused. Every year he pauses, and the wardens have learned it is not grief and let it be. Tess Calder met him at the foot of the line, 50 now, gray gone white at the temples, senior guide of a North Coast district that has its full chain of cabins back, steel vaulted, the new pattern, his pattern. The engineers wanted to call the design the Hess Cache, and he declined, and so they are Calder boxes, which he considers the single shrewdest investment of his career. She looked him over the way she looks weather over. "You've kept the boots," she said. "They hold," said the magnate of the Tessin exchange, and picked up the heaviest pack in the line before anyone could hand him a lighter one. On the 3rd day of that first return walk, on the ridge above the ostler bar, she stopped the column with one raised hand and pointed, and Hesk followed the line of her arm and felt the coast close a circle on him. A grayback was working the river mouth. A young one, barely 800 kilos, the human judge, gray going to slate along the spine, with the lankness of an animal still learning what its frame would be owed, quartering the bar at low water in patient sweeps, reading the shag elk trails, pausing at the staging rocks on the seaport side, and standing there a long moment, considering the way an apprentice stands in a master's empty workshop. The South Parish, vacant 1 year, had a candidate. 3 winters, maybe 4, and he'll hold it all, she said. He's already found the rocks. They always find the rocks. She watched the young animal with the working respect Hess now understood was the coast's only true currency. And then she said the thing he wrote, later, into the charter of the Warden Endowment, on the page where charters keep their reasons. "People off-world ask me why we don't clear them out of the crossings. Make the coast safe. I tell them there's no such animal as a safe coast. There's only a coast you've read right and a coast you haven't. He's not the hazard, sir. He's the 5th lantern with legs. A world where nothing can kill you is a world that never once tells you the truth." Hesk stood on the ridge in the wind, watching 1,200 future kilos of truth learn its parish, and found he was, of all the things he had been in his gilded and expensive life, glad, implausibly, unprofitably glad that the galaxy still contained shores that would not negotiate. "He'll need a name eventually," he said. "Cadets get to propose. Wardens vote." She shouldered her pack. "Current favorite is the auditor. Strong candidate," said the magnate. "I'll say nothing." They walked the South Coast together for 9 days, the way they do every year, the warden of record and her one permanent client, no rifle in the column but hers, no schedule but the tides. They walked the drowned miles where a skiff's bones still surface some winters at the spring ebb. They walked the shell ridge where a magnate first hauled another being's weight, and the ostler bar at the bottom of the ebb, roped in order, because the standard is the standard no matter whose name is on the moon, technically. And on the 9th day they come to the causeway under the White Tower and stop, and Hesk sets down the pack and pays the only debt the syndicate rate has no schedule for. It has never once been a speech. The first year he tried to make it one. He had notes. Beings of his station always have notes. And she let him get 4 words in before she handed him a tideline debate, and he understood, and that was the last of the notes. Now it goes the way it goes. They stand on the black stone where the gray came up out of the water, where the South Parish changed wardens, where the most expensive rifle in 3 systems finally earned its prayer in a calloused grip that has never once owned anything. The sea breathes, the tower light turns. And Andavar Hesk, who promised a roomful of chandeliers that he would stand among them in 10 days with a dead king under his arm, and who instead was stood by a quiet human, on a painted mark at the bottom of his own ledger, and taught what a being is worth when the money is subtracted, says it plainly, the new way, the way you say true things on a Lantern 5 world. "Thank you, Warden. You hauled your share," says Tess Calder, shouldering her pack, already reading the water for the crossing home. "Keep up." He keeps up.